because it's just kind of a perfect opportunity to celebrate everything that we love about Seattle, everything we don't know yet about Seattle. And I cannot wait to give a conversation with these three wonderful folks. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that the place where we gather and the places we will be discussing tonight are on the traditional lands of the first people of Seattle, Duwamish people past and present. Let's take a moment tonight to honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe, a people who are still here continuing to bring their ancient heritage to light. Award-winning journalist Harriet Baskas is happiest at an airport, odd attraction, or unusual museum. She writes about these and many other topics for outlets that include NBCnews.com, The Points Guy, AAA Journey, Cruise Critic, Runway Girl Network, and others. Her work has also appeared on CNBC, USA Today, Afar, and other outlets. Harriet served as the general manager of 3 community radio stations, KBOO and KMUN in Oregon and KBCS in Bellevue, Washington. And she's created award-winning radio programs on topics as varied as early cowgirls, unusual museums, and aging boomers for National Public Radio and for regional public radio stations. She is the creator of the StuckAtTheAirport.com blog and the author of 9 books, including Hidden Treasures, What Museums Can or Won't Show You, and 111 Places in Seattle That You Must Not Miss. Susanna Ryan is an illustrator and author of the best-selling book Seattle Walk Report, an illustrated walking tour through 23 Seattle neighborhoods, and Secret Seattle, an illustrated guide to the city's offbeat and overlooked history. In 2021, she was named one of Seattle Magazine's most influential people in Washington State. Her work has been featured by the Seattle Times, Evening Magazine, and Atlas Obscura. David B. Williams is a naturalist, author, and educator. His many books include the award-winning Too High and Too Steep, Reshaping Seattle's Topography, and Seattle Walks, Discovering History and Nature in the City. Without further ado, it is our pleasure to present our authors this evening.
Greetings. Somehow I got asked to go first because, I remember, it's reverse alphabetical order. So, and it's an honor and pleasure to have all of you here. And I'd first like to thank Harriet for inviting me and the bookstore for, of course, hosting this. I think one of the things that we who live in Seattle and those of us who spend a lot of time wandering the city know that we are truly blessed with amazing independent bookstores that have helped make this community so strong. So I thank the University Bookstore for that. What we'd like to do at the beginning is each of us talk for a little bit, probably 2 or 3 hours each, about our books. We'll be reading each one of them very slowly to you. And then we'll entertain questions and amuse ourselves throughout the evening. But in light of that, I think we're each going to talk for about 5 or 6 minutes about the books. And then we'd love to have interactive. Our goal is to share stories. We'd love to hear from what you have to say. Just beginning, even before we started, I learned about the fact that there are at least 3 periscopes in buildings in Seattle. And I thought that was pretty cool. I didn't know, I knew of one, but that there's 3 and one in a men's room. So it goes up. So, that's pretty cool. So even though the book in front of me is Home Waters, which is a book that I did about human and natural history in Seattle, I'd actually rather talk a little bit more about my book, Seattle Walks, which is 17 walks around the city. And I was lucky enough to spend a fair amount of time been lucky over the years to spend time in Seattle. And walking is one of the things I love to do, and I think that's something we all share, is this love of getting out and discovering place on our feet and seeing what we can learn and seeing the stories that are there and moving at a pace that allows us to see the stories instead of, what was that? What was that? By slowing down, walking. And for me, for many years, I never had a cell phone, so it was even better that I didn't have any reason to look at that. But this book really grew out of these adventures and sharing the place with friends. I would lead them on walks, and that got me into thinking about this. And I always view the city, and wherever I am, whether in the wild or in the city, through the lens of geology, and furthermore, through the lens of connections. How do we influence landscape, and how does landscape influence us? So I tried to do that in this book. I'm always interested in those natural history stories. But as a writer, I see myself as a natural history writer, and that I'm also deeply interested in the history of a place. So that's what I've attempted to do, is point out things in the landscape. And again, I think like each of us, where we're hoping to get you to make stronger connections to place, to slow down, to be more observant, to ask questions about things that you walk by. I've led tours for many years in Seattle to a variety of different groups. And I was leading one downtown a couple of years ago, and we stopped across the street from the Broadrick building, which is at 2nd and Cherry. And while there, someone walked by, my neighbor walked by. In fact, she'd worked in that building for 17 years. And on my walk was someone who else had worked in that building for 17 years. And what I was pointing out to them was, if you look on the 4th and 5th floors of that building, there's 74 carved faces up there. 34 years of experience going to that building every day, they had never noticed that. And I'm not saying I'm special, but the fact is that I try to slow down and hope that these stories will encourage people to look at that landscape that they've always walked by, because there are amazing stories here. And to me, that just makes it a richer experience, being in the landscape, seeing the places, and again, wondering, what is going on? Why did they do this? Who are those faces up there? Who carved them? Why did they carve them? No one sees them, and yet they're up there. There's some story. I've never been able to figure it out, but they are out there. And one of the things that I know I've tried to do is find the stories. And one of the things I love about Susanna's work is she finds these stories, and we've gone back and forth. We just had a correspondence about the tiles embedded in Madison Avenue. And I had looked for years to try and find the story, and she found it like in 20 minutes of tracking it down. So they're out there. Pay attention, ask questions, slow down, carry binoculars, carry a camera, carry a pencil, carry a coffee mug, and enjoy the city. And I think that's what we've been trying to do in our books. That's all I have to say for now.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. My name is Susanna, and I would just like to talk a little bit about my journey into walking and into books, because it's actually fairly recent that I got into walking at all. Before 2017, I was not a walker. If I was walking, it was pretty much to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible, so I could go back home and just draw the blinds and sit in the dark. And so one day in 2017, something just compelled me to leave my apartment one day without any time restraints or any destination. And on that day, for some reason, I stepped out my front door and it all just clicked. All these things that I lived in Capitol Hill at the time. I still live there, but I was in a different apartment. I left my apartment, and suddenly I was seeing all these things that I had walked by a million times, but just never taken the time to notice before. Several blocks from me, I found a park that I never even knew existed. I was seeing all these dogs, and it was suddenly like these little mysteries were waiting to be unraveled all around me. These little things that no one would maybe notice if you weren't paying attention. And so from that day on, walking was all I wanted to do. And if I had a day off from my job, I work for the Seattle Public Library, I still do. If I had a day off from my job, I would just spend all day walking. And it started, a couple miles here, a couple miles there, and then it just got more and more ambitious. I was suddenly walking from Capitol Hill to Lake City, from Lake City to Rainier Beach. And since 2017, when I started walking for fun and really got into this, I've walked over 20,000 miles across Seattle. But it all just started on that one random day. A couple weeks or months into walking, I started to not be able to remember everything that I was seeing on my walks, but it was becoming such a big part of my life. So I just got the idea, what if I made something like an illustrated travel journal just for myself to remember all these great things that I've seen? Maybe I'll make a map of where I went, say how long it took, say, oh, I saw a cute dog and something else, So I had this idea, I thought I would keep it to myself, but I made the first installment. I wrote Seattle Walk Report across the top because it just seemed like the most sensible thing to name something like this. And after creating it, I drew some of the things I saw. I tallied how many times I had to wait at a crosswalk versus how many times I could just go freely. So I just had all these little things and I made a little comic about it. And after I did, I was like, I just feel like this should be out here for other people to see, even if no one ever does. This is just something that's so personal and just so me, and I'm just gonna put it out there because walking had changed my life and it had changed my perspective of Seattle completely in such a short period of time. So I started an Instagram account called Seattle Walk Report. I just kept walking, I kept making comics about it, just kept posting it, and then about a year into that, I got the opportunity to make a book. Which was not something that I was expecting. It was not something I had set out to do as somebody who works for the library and has been around books my whole life. It was super exciting, and I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to do this. And so in I think it was just about 4 months that I had to make my first book, Seattle Walk Report. And in that time, I walked 65 miles through all these different neighborhoods. I gathered all new material for the book because I just wanted it to be all fresh and not stuff that I had previously shared. After that book came out, I got the opportunity to make a second book called Secret Seattle, which came out in 2021. I actually started that book in March 2020, a completely unremarkable month that you probably don't remember. So it was an interesting time to work on a book about Seattle at the very start of the pandemic when everything felt so uncertain. I didn't know what the world would look like or what Seattle would look like by the time the book came out. So it was just kind of an interesting experience. But for Secret Seattle, I was able to dig in a little bit more to the history of the things that I see around me. Whereas Seattle Walk Report was very much like, oh, I saw some cute dogs and I saw these shoes on a telephone wire in Capitol Hill and I saw a brownie on the sidewalk or something like that. I just, for Secret Seattle, dug a little bit more into the history of some of the things that you can see any old day in Seattle with a real focus on stuff that is just out, just stuff that you can see anytime. I kind of view Seattle as a little museum where anywhere you go, you can see these interesting, unique things. You just have to look, basically. So that's kind of my journey and how this whole thing started. It's been very unexpected. It's been very cool. I certainly don't feel like one of the most influential people in Washington State when I'm like sitting there trying to decide which baking competition to watch on Netflix. But it's been really cool, and it's such an honor to have the opportunity to connect with people and do events like this and just talk to people who are just so excited about things. People just tell you exciting things all the time when you write a book like this. So.
And people just love telling me things about. So like that's what I learned. Like sometimes if you just ask a question, if you're curious, then you'll find out all these things. So the same month that she started Secret Seattle, I got sent a book by a PR person called 111 Places in Portland That You Must Not Miss. And I remember I had, at that point, or up until like the week before, I was doing international travel all the time, and I went from a lot of work to no work. And I opened up a envelope, 111 Places in Portland, and I said, I remember thinking two things. I used to live in Portland. It was for locals and experienced travelers. And I thought, let's see if they really know their stuff, because I used to live in Portland. And they had really things that I didn't know about. And then I remember thinking, this is really sad. No one's going to read this book because the pandemic had just been declared. But in my house, we call it now, I flacked the flack. I called up the PR person and I said, first I looked up who wrote the Seattle version, and no one had. There was no book there. And then I asked the flack, who's writing the Seattle version? And she said, nobody is. And I said, why not? She said, we just haven't found the right quirky person yet. And obviously that was me. So that's what I did during the pandemic. I walked the city like all of us did. And I worked with a photographer. They buddied me up with this woman who I didn't know. And so I would write a couple of chapters. I would call up these places and make them open their doors just for me and the photographer. And we would show up in our masks. The first 6 months, we drove around in separate cars with our masks. The people would open their doors. We could run in and take a picture and ask some more questions. And that's how we started doing it. So we tried to avoid restaurants or places that we weren't sure would ever reopen. So there were some places that I wanted to put in that we kind of had to skip over. And it's interesting, for the second edition, the two places that I did have to change out were the two restaurants that I put in. Took a chance. And it was just a really fun way for me to learn more about the city. Now, I've lived here since 1988. I've done, of those 9 books that Milo mentioned, 6 of them were guidebooks to the Northwest, Oregon, and Washington. And so, you know, we all think if we've lived here, we know everything about the city, but clearly we don't. And so that was really fun. I put out the word to, you know, online to friends to give me ideas, and I learned about so many new things. And that was just a reminder that our city still holds surprises for us. So just one of the ones I learned about. I mean, I could talk, of course, about 111 of them, but or 222, because every one of those had to have a tip that was also unusual. But I didn't know that the headquarters for geocaching is in Seattle. It's in Fremont. I didn't know that. And when I went there, and it was one of those places that was still closed during the pandemic, I couldn't find it. So I got the coordinates, but I couldn't find it. But yeah, so that one is great. So if you like to look for things and you know geocaching, people come from all over the world to go to headquarters of geocaching. It's in Fremont. And I'm going to stop there.
Well, it sounds like each of us were little observers. Are there tips that you have for people who may want to start to see the world in this sort of way, but don't quite know how to get started?
That's a great question. I think, and for me, it's slowing down and not being in such a rush and going everywhere. And sort of sounds trite, but you know, sort of being in the moment and being present in that aspect. I mean, for me, the amount of times I've walked through downtown Seattle where I'm just focusing on one thing, like, okay, I'm going to just focus on, you know, things at ground level or things at eye level. And so part of it too is just, trying different ways of doing it and going back over and over. I think we're often have this idea that, oh, I've been to volunteer park. Well, have you been to volunteer park in the snow, in the spring, in the summer? You know, there's so going back over and over and going with friends because they point things out that you've never seen or they know things you don't know. So those would be some of the things. Oh, and drink coffee. It never hurts.
I guess because my background is being a reporter, being a journalist, so I am not shy to ask questions. I'm not shy to open doors. I'm not. There's some places that you won't get to see unless you open that door or ask a question. So I guess that's mine. I just the way I did the museum book that she mentioned. I had been going to museums in a lot of small towns, and often if you go to like the Pioneer Museum in a town, if you look in the guest book, you're the first visitor that has been there for a month. So if there's a volunteer, they really want to talk to you. So I remember I started asking the people there, what's your favorite thing? So if you go to a museum or you go to some place, ask them their favorite thing. And you get some good stories, but this one woman turned to me and said, well, if you think that's interesting, you should see what we have in the back room. So asking questions and trying to get a story from someone is a good way to see their place.
I really agree with what David said, and that's been really true to my experience as well. Kind of going out, especially in a place that you've lived a long time, if you've lived in Seattle for a while, you've lived in your apartment for a while, whatever the case may be, I feel like we kind of have a map in our head. We know, okay, this is the quickest route to the grocery store, this is where the cutest little free library is, all these little details. But do we really know what is on our block? Have we really closely looked at that tree on the corner that we know is there, or looked at our neighbor's mailbox? I mean, don't look inside, but these little details, and just by kind of tuning into what's there rather than your idea of what may be there, you can find some really surprising things. Some of the greatest kind of walking discoveries of my life have been in Capitol Hill, where I've probably walked more than any other place in Seattle, have lived longer than any other place. And I'm constantly just finding new things I hadn't noticed before, whether it's something that's kind of ephemeral and just, a goldfish cracker on the sidewalk or whatever, or something that's like a little piece of a building or something that I've never seen before. So just kind of by slowing down and tuning in and not assuming, oh, it's a mailbox is a mailbox, but really looking, what does that little flag on the mailbox look like, that sort of thing. And also just eliminating distractions. When I'm walking, I don't tend to have AirPods in, I'm not on my phone, I might be like taking a quick picture or something, but just kind of being present with that environment.
So what's the most exciting thing you found?
You know, I get asked that question a lot, and
I hope you have an answer.
and I really don't have an answer, unfortunately, because I kind of find everything, I find everything cool and amazing because I actually do have standards, but I just tend to really be in awe of whatever that day has for me. And just kind of marveling at whatever it may be that day rather than a particular thing. It's another thing too, people will ask me, what's your favorite walk in Seattle? Thinking, you know, I might be an expert on it, but really I believe that the best walk in Seattle is one that starts right outside your front door, where you don't have any time restraints, where you just kind of flow in whatever direction seems interesting that day and go for it. Like those are the best walks I've ever had. I'm also somebody who doesn't drive. I've never had my driver's license, so I don't know how. So it's just, whenever I would think about walking before I got really into it, I thought, oh, that sounds like a great walk over in West Seattle, but how am I gonna get to West Seattle to start that great walk, you know? And so when I realized that a great walk would start right outside my front door, everything changed. Do you have a favorite thing you've ever seen on a walk?
Do I have a favorite thing I've ever seen on a walk? The discovering those spaces, I brought up the Broadroot building, and that was only because I was in my wife's office, which was directly across the street and was on about the same level, so it was up a little bit higher. That's certainly one of them. I'm always interested when I find connections for things I didn't realize, like there's along Seward Park, I don't know if it's a light post that has these fish at the bottom, they're metal fish, that hold up the light post, and the exact same fish are at the locks. So I always think it's sort of fun when these sort of random connections. Again, having been out there enough and coming across things like, oh yeah. Or there's the Seafirst, what were the Seafirst banks. There's three, maybe four of them, the exact same model of bank, but they're in different parts of the city. But it was sort of a neat revelation. Oh, okay, that architect just did that one over and over again. And maybe hopefully the company realized what he or she was doing. But it's also really interesting because that building, at least the one that's below the Space Needle, is made of a 330 million year old limestone, and it's filled with fossils. So I think it's cool when you find fossils in buildings, and there's a bunch. If you go to the Grand Hyatt Hotel and you go to the bathroom, there's some great fossils in the bathroom, men's and women's. I've been told, I've not been in the women's bathroom, but it's a 155 million year old German limestone, and there's what look like cinnamon rolls or ammonites, and that's pretty cool.
I would like to think, so speaking of bathrooms, at the Pacific Science Center, there's a set of bathrooms that are themed off the Grossology book, which is probably here on, and so you go in there and like on the wall, you could just imagine like parents with kids waiting to use the bathroom, the story of farts and things like that. So those are in the bathrooms there, those I like. One of the things like in my neighborhood, I live in Ballard, and every day I walk to the Ballard locks. And along the way, just down 24th, I think it is the Pacific Fishermen's Shipyard. And I'm not a fisherman, I don't have a boat, but in that yard, over the years that I've lived in Ballard, their collection of neon signs and old signs from restaurants and bars has been growing. And I knew it was there. I knew that at night, if you went down in the like dusk or at night, that they were lit up, but I didn't know how they got there or what they were doing. And so for the book, I was able to get this great cigar smoking fisherman to tell me all about it. And I said, well, how did you get that one? How did you get that one? And he said, about a couple of them, he said, well, it was the darndest thing. I was driving by at 4 a.m. and it just fell into the back of my head. I said, can I share that? He said, go ahead. So yeah, that's just like, just things that you see every day, but you look closer. And I think from the pandemic, we all did that probably. Everyone probably has a story of something in their neighborhood that they didn't know was there before, and that should be kind of a lesson to all of us, that we can all do this.
Was there anything that you wanted to include in the book that either you didn't have a friendly fisherman to give you some details, or you just couldn't get enough information about it?
Well, because I'm a museum person, I wanted to put in more museums. And this is part of a series, so they're in a lot of cities. And so I was given a list. So I know I didn't want to put crime and haunted places in, but I had to. That was really creepy. So Ted Bundy's dormitory is in the book, even though the University of Washington asked me not to put that in. So I wanted to put in more museums, and the editor kept saying that I hit my limit. So I want to do a book of just museums in Seattle.
Okay, I got my favorite place. I realized the place that was my favorite place. It's on Pigeon Point. I'm sure everyone knows where Pigeon Point is. If you don't know where Pigeon Point is, it's the west side of West Seattle. And there's a school there. And I was told that there was a facility there that had been used to spy on the Japanese during World War II, and they used it for nuclear testing. No. What is that story? So I was able to track down this story about this facility, and it's still there. It's an underground bunker that was used during World War II. It was then subsequently used afterwards for research on leukemia, from which the person won the Nobel Prize. And if you go to the school, I think it's the Louisa Boren School. That's not the Louisa Boren School. What is it? It's not Pigeon Point. The school in Pigeon Point. I can't forget what it's called. But the school parking lot's built on top of this underground building that was used for nuclear experiments. And I talked to all sorts of people. No one had ever heard this story, and that was really fun to find that story. But it's there. The parking lot's just right on top. You can't access. There's a variety of spaces in Seattle that are underground that you can't access that I think are really cool, like the toilets under the pergola. You know, the reason the pergola has the lights, those lights are vent releases for the toilets that are underneath there. There's a few other places.
I have one,
Oh,
yes. So one place I wanted to put in but couldn't because it had turned into like a homeless camp was that under the freeway, we went to try to, I wouldn't go by myself, there's a fallout shelter that's inside a freeway ramp. I thought that would be perfect to at least point people to there's a door, but it was just too creepy.
it's in my book. And if you know the Mossback or Knut Berger, he got his driver's license at that facility because it used to be where the driver's license office was.
So someday they will open that for us and we can all together go on a tour.
That's so funny. I thought about trying to find a way to have like a book launch party for Secret Seattle in that bunker, but I was turned down.
Someone I've met once said he had a key and he would let me in any time, but I don't remember who it is and I never took him up on it, sadly.
So we will have a reunion in the year all together in that. Questions? Yeah.
Do you all have questions? We can keep
Or
chit-chatting.
tips?
Yeah.
I have a question, but first a 30-second story for David. We used your book. We looked at the fossils in the Hyatt floor with our Boy Scouts. And one of the dog captains came over and said, about once a week, people come in here, they stare at the floor, they take pictures, they high-five each other and leave. What's going on? And so we showed him the fossils and he was delighted.
That is outstanding.
But my question is, so hypothetically, if your brother-in-law from Atlanta who's never been here is coming to Seattle, where do you take him? Hypothetically.
Where do you live?
Here.
You walk out your front door.
Okay, there you go. There you go.
He wants to know where they take.
Yeah, where would? Because I may send
I
them to
take
you.
people to those neon signs.
Okay.
I'm a big fan of parks. I know that's kind of a, but Seattle has so many wonderful parks, and I think you could just spend a day kind of weaving between a bunch of them, especially on like Capitol Hill, going from Volunteer Park to the Louise Boren Lookout, and just kind of walking around, having some coffee. I guess it's true. Walking around with coffee is what I always just tell people to do.
And I think the locks are an incredible place. There's no other city in the country that has a set of locks like ours that you can walk across. That is an unusual situation. If you want a random tidbit, next time you're at the locks, stand there, look out to Puget Sound. Can you see Puget Sound from the locks? Does anyone know the answer to that? You cannot. They were purposely located because concern about the locks being attacked by enemy bombardment.
But please don't stand there too long because this time of year, there's too many tourists standing on those walkways. I get mad. Because they're walkways, but please go now because the salmon, there's so many salmon in the fish ladders right now and jumping. It's really a cool destination.
I also like taking people to the central library just because people either love it or hate it. And I like that a building can have such, people can have such strong feelings about a building. And it's just an interesting place to check out.
What's your feeling of love-hate
Of that building?
for people that you take for yourself and or yourself?
I like it. I think it's not necessary for it to look the way that it does. And I like that. I like that it's kind of unique. I like that it's interesting. I like that whenever one of the windows breaks, it costs like $200,000 to replace it and have to fly in from somewhere. I just think it's a cool building.
And you don't have to be looking for a book to go enjoy that building.
Yeah, because if you are looking for a book, it's a pain in the bush. It's a horrible design. That being said, the coolest room in the building is the one I go to most, the Seattle room on the 10th floor. If you've never been there, that's the best room in the library. And it's all black, beautiful space up there. So I really appreciate that they devoted the space to the history of Seattle, gave it the best space in the entire building.
If we're talking about weird buildings, my editor said, "Oh, everyone knows that Seattle Central, don't write about that." But Mopop, people still think that's just the weirdest looking building. I mean, we don't know. It's Mopop. Yeah, keep calling it the Experience
It's the
Music
Jimi
Lodge.
Hendrix Museum.
Yeah. But that's a building you want to show people definitely and get their opinion.
Is there any place when we leave here this evening, we're in the University District, is there any place we should stop by when we leave here before we go home?
Well, I always like, is it Savory Hall on the UW campus that has all the figures on top, all the different disciplines? I think that's an interesting building. The church just up the block on 45th, the northeast corner of 45th and 15th. That has limestone that has a bunch of fossils in it. So those are two of my places I like.
This is like such a sad pastime of mine, but I really like to walk down the Ave and just imagine what the buildings look like without their little banners on them. I'm struggling to think of the word right now. And just kind of seeing there are some like really interesting older apartment buildings or just buildings in general, but they're kind of obscured by signage or other things. So I just like to kind of get my X-ray glasses out and walk around and look at the buildings a little bit more closely.
Well, since we are in the University District, and even though I'm not allowed to tell you which one, Ted Bundy's dormitory is on the campus. The college and pub is haunted, so we might want to go there.
And on 45th, at the bank building there's a stream under there's a trap door, or this little weird door in the basement of it. And I was told once that there was a stream underneath there. And when I was able to talk my way into it and went down, and there's a little bit of water flowing underneath that bank. So it's no longer a bank. I don't know. I got showed this when it was a bank, and the people operating the bank said, "Oh, don't tell anyone." It's like, who's going to tunnel under the building, into the basement, come up through this little crack, and then,
It seems like something you might do.
Once they got to know me, they realized how reputable I was.
So David, I was just in Northern Europe and saw a lot of Art Nouveau buildings. And I know I've listened to your talk on all the figurines and stuff downtown.
Yeah.
Is that from the Art Nouveau period? What's behind all the walruses? And
All the carved and terracotta
Yeah,
animals, most of those were done between roughly 1890s and 1930s. A lot of it was that I think it's Beaux-Arts design. Is that the design really elaborate? It was just a period when they had much more elaborate architecture. And so those figures went up. And as I write in the book, a lot of them had to do with messages. There's the horse head, which used to be a stable. There's the fish on the natatorium. So there's also, but it was just a very tight period of architecture that was much more about elaborate design. You know, now we're just the opposite. You know, if it isn't perfectly flat, you know, people. Yeah.
So I just celebrated 10 years in Seattle, so a full decade. Over that time period, I've noticed a lot of change. I'm curious to know from all of you, what is something that you hope that never changes about Seattle?
Hope that never changes.
Never changes, Seattle.
That's a great question.
Well, go ahead.
I was gonna say, the support of independent bookstores has been tremendous, and I'm not just saying that to get brownie points here or anything. Seattle has so many wonderful independent bookstores, and I don't think any of us would be here today in this exact position writing kind of niche local books if it weren't for the support of all the wonderful independent bookstores.
And I think I'm again a big fan of quirk. So I just hope that the ability to be quirky or have a quirky store or a space or not, you know, a little personal museum that can let people in doesn't change. And over the years, it's gotten more expensive and people are less allowed to do that. So I hope that doesn't change. Like the giant shoe museum down under in the High Place Market, that is in danger of getting pushed out there. Some other places also, I just worry about that. Like they just took down the neon sign of the diving lady at the Olympic, in my neighborhood, and I was gonna go out and lie down in front of the machinery. And it's like, you can't take those things away from me.
I would say bald eagles. We have an incredible population of bald eagles, and if we have bald eagles, it means we have a lot of other things that go with bald eagles. We have this incredible, a decent number of trees here. We have the waterway, we have the fish, so they're all tied together. So it's really the natural world for me that I think we sometimes tend to forget how lucky we are. Obviously, it's not as ideal as many of us would like, but still a pretty impressive range of trees, plants, animals in this landscape. And the fact that you can still find places within Seattle and feel like you're in a place that is not in a city, that it's wild enough, there is no feeling of being in an urban environment. I think that is a gift.
It reminds me of something we said before about when you go out, we know our routines, and like I walk the locks during the day, during the morning, but recently we had a friend and we walked in the evening and it was like a whole different place. There was an owl sitting right there along the sidewalk. It's like you would never see that at 7 in the morning, but at 7 at night you would see it. So that's a good tip.
Yeah, along the same lines, as Seattle changes, you know, there's been so much change in the last decade, 15 years. Are the quirky, interesting places being protected? And as Seattle sort of becomes a little bit more like other cities, are there cool things that are being developed that the additions to Seattle still have interesting stories to tell?
One thing that I think about a lot is just that Seattle has always been in a state of change. Like there isn't one period that you can point to and say, that was Seattle, and then from there on, nothing was ever again. The city that we live in looked really different 20 years ago. It looked really different 20 years before that. And so one thing that I kind of just try to do and think about is I don't want to say be the change that you want to see in Seattle, but I could have just as easily kept my comic and my walking habits to myself, and I chose not to. And I decided to be a little bit vulnerable and put myself out there. And because I did that, a lot of things changed, and I've been able to inspire people to go out and explore their neighborhoods in different ways. And I'm just one person, and you're all people, and you all have unique gifts and talents inside of you. And I just think that if we share stuff that we're enthusiastic about, or if there's a building that we like, saying, hey, that building's cool, just kind of carrying that excitement and momentum forward, and just kind of being the Seattleite we want to be, you know? I know that doesn't exactly answer your question, but
That's like you create the tribe. So there's more of us who care about it. and will lie down in front of that.
And I think there are little things that are cute and change about Seattle all the time. We're like, the proliferation of little free libraries over the last couple of years has been wild, and little pantries and refrigerators and all these different kind of quiet community things for people. I think that's really cool. Yeah, you're right, that buildings leave a little bit to be desired, new buildings that are being put in. But there are just these little things, but I think that if you're kind of so just, this is how my neighborhood looks, this is how things are, if you stay in that mindset, I think you're setting yourself up for disappointment because things aren't going to change always.
But it's also supporting those places. If there's a restaurant that's quirky or a place that's quirky, you have to support it. Like the Yale Curiosity Shop, it's not always gonna be there because times are changing around them. Feels like it has always been here, but times are getting challenging even for them.
You were leading me with a question. What are those ceramic pieces of medicine that you
Oh, what are the ceramic?
please, because I saw them and you had to answer that question.
I'm not gonna answer because I have no idea.
Okay, the question was about on Madison Street and in some other streets in Seattle, there are these blue and white tile markers that have the name of the street embedded in the cement in each intersection. And they're you can see the most of them along Madison Street. So they're actually from one weird 6-month period in 1904. Basically, the city was looking for ways to increase signage in the city. There wasn't really a comprehensive system for labeling streets at all. And it sounds like it was just pure chaos. So in 1903, they did this experiment where they put both signs on posts and metal letters embedded in cement around the city to see which one people liked more. The signs on posts won, so then the city started to install street signs on posts. But then the next summer, they were looking for ways to continue to improve the pedestrian experience in Seattle. And so they decided, okay, on every new sidewalk going forward, we're going to put in these blue and white tile markers. And it was a huge time in the city for getting concrete sidewalks. And so there was all this sidewalk work happening. They're like, great, we'll do this tile thing at the same time. They gave the tile contract to this guy who actually started Seattle's very first tile and mantle business after moving here from New York in 1889. And then 6 months later, they decided that they were worthless. There was this little short article in the Seattle PI that said signs are worthless, and that the city council had decided at their meeting the day before that they will never use tile signs again. And that was the end of it. So it was just between June and December of 1904 that these tile markers came in. So all the ones on Madison are from that weird 6-month period. It's pretty cool.
How many of the metal ones have you found?
A lot. I don't have a number, but I have kind of my phone is a mess of different albums of photos and things. I've probably found over 50 of the metal ones. And so those are the ones from the year before, 1903, with that experiment that they did. And I understand why in a city like Seattle where it rains all the time and there's leaves on the ground and everything, why maybe these things weren't so popular and maybe why they ended up being worthless. But it's pretty cool to see that they're still around all these years later and to think about the hundreds and thousands of people who have walked past those tiles over the years and wondered about them and not had an answer.
Especially when it's a different name of the street.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of the streets are the old street names or have the old directionals. In 1961, 1961, Seattle changed some of the directionals on their streets. So like on Madison, it might say that it's north or something on what's now an east street. So that's pretty cool too.
Do you know where they put in the posts? I would guess that all of those disappeared millions of years ago.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that there aren't any original posts or signage from that period. It was actually, I can't believe I'm here talking about this. It's just so exciting to me. The street signage in Seattle was actually a huge mess up until about 1963, when Seattle first got the green and white reflective signs that we have today. They just wouldn't invest properly into the street signs that were needed to be functional, basically, and the technology, the reflectiveness wasn't quite there yet. So the city just kept every 5 years slapping some cheap tin signs around town, being like, okay, that's all good. And then child vandals would come and tear them down, and then they'd have to start all over again. So it was a huge mess, and there are letters to the editor of the Seattle Times throughout decades that are like, you have a beautiful city, I was thinking about moving here, but I cannot deal with the street sign situation. Or someone who said, I went to the Seattle World's Fair, it was great, but I had no idea where I was. So it really wasn't until 1963 with those first green and white signs that the city finally kind of figured it out once and for all.
Child vandals.
It still exists.
Yeah, what is this? I mean, do we have records that it was children?
Yes, actually.
No adults ever vandalized a sign in the history of Seattle.
There was this scourge of what the Seattle Times called small boys. I'm serious. And they said small boys are undoing the work of the city signage department, and all these articles, and even decades and decades later when they were reflecting on the old sign situation, they would say those small boys just wouldn't stop. They even found that small boys were priming up the metal letters that they had put in 1903. And so they were like, oh, this is great, this will be indestructible. And then these little boys were out there with crowbars, I guess, just stealing letters. I mean, I guess they didn't have YouTube or whatever, so they had to do something, but.
Have you ever thought of trying to see if you can find any of those people?
Oh, any of the small boys of yours? I don't know, I should put out a call.
Oh, that would just be brilliant.
Yeah.
You could waste a lot of time doing it.
My next book would be Small Boys of Seattle.
Creepy small boys of Seattle.
Street merchants. Street smart urchins.
There's some what I would call hitching posts around town. Is that what they are?
There are hitching posts around town. There's two up on 14th Avenue on what they call Millionaires Row. There's one in front of the Fry Art Museum. I guess there's three up on 14th Avenue. There's one in Queen Anne. There's two. Magnolia.
I'm in Queen Anne. There's right by the high school.
Yeah, okay. So there's a handful of amounts. So I think they are all original from when horsepower meant horsepower in Seattle. That's the sort of best record that I've ever found of horses. And there's I think 3 or 4 stables left. The best one is the one that's at Western and Blanchard that has a horse head on it. It's a model of a horse. Yeah, people are in Seattle very earnest and serious.
Is there anything you've discovered in doing research based on walks or whatever, where you're like, this is too messed up to share?
Of course not. The more messed up, the better.
I didn't know if you had any personal kind of threshold or,
I have no personal threshold. Thank you for asking or thinking I might. You?
No.
Good. I can answer that question. I found a rubber prosthetic breast. It was near Lincoln Springs. And it was there. I walked past it one day and I told Mary about it. The next couple of days later, I went back with a plastic bag and I actually brought it home.
Your museum. It was big, too.
It was a good one, yeah. Anyway, I took it back to the neighborhood after that. But
We'll have to go look because I live in Lincoln
I
Springs.
think that would go into your category. Yeah. Yeah, I've seen a lot of things that unmentionable.
I really didn't want to retell the story of Ted Bundy. I didn't want to have to read about it or any of the serial killers. I didn't want to point out places where people were murdered, even though there's people who travel around the world to see places where people were murdered. I didn't want to do that, so I did as little as I was able to get away with. Though I will say that in South Park, the curiosity shop there has a wonderful display case of serial killer souvenirs. There's some Ted Bundy stuff, there's some Green River Killer stuff, there's some, the clown killer. You've got a whole section there.
Someone went around killing clowns?
No, the guy who was dressed up as a clown. Anyway. And on Halloween, we did an event there, and he actually was willing to open the case, and you could have your picture taken with any of those serial killer gifts.
Oh,
Yeah. It's in South Park, it's a curiosity shop. So the editor tried to convince me not to have, because I wanted the Yale, we're blessed with several curiosity shops. There's, because of the Yale Curiosity Shop, that's influenced people here. So we've got Ballyhoo and Ballard, like based on the Yale Curiosity Shop. We've got the Curiosity Shop at South Park, and then our Yale Curiosity Shop. So they all have weird, super weird things from murderers. Go there in the daytime with somebody.
Yeah.
Big Top Curiosity Shop, that's the one in South Park.
I have a question. So Austin here, my husband, walks 10 miles every day. And I just want to know, if you, and a lot of you might be walkers too, do you find russet potatoes on your walk? Yes?
Yeah.
What's the deal?
What's with potatoes?
Wait. They're like on someone's porch, they're throwing, it's just an individual russet potato abandoned.
Yes, an abandoned.
Last week I found some behind a hedge near, in North Everett.
What are you looking behind?
Leave those most of the time, they're just on the sidewalk, like a potato.
Cooked or uncooked?
Or it's a russet, right? Or your russet?
I don't know if I have potatoes.
Well, it's interesting, we had something that looked like,
a potato.
well, we looked like, I thought we had what looked like potatoes coming up in our yard. I knew they weren't potatoes because they were just all by themselves, but there's a puffball mushroom
Oh, no,
that
these
looks
are
like a potato. I'm just sharing that, I know they're different,
Oh.
I just wanted to share. Sharing that there are also things that look like, so you have to be careful because there are potatoes and then there are things that look like ersatz potatoes that are out there too, trying to mess with you.
But you were talking about before about going to every library and every pea patch. So here's another thing you can do if you haven't done it yet. Have you learned about the Friends? This is one thing I learned about Friends of Street Ends.
Yeah.
So there's so many little corners of Seattle, and there's I think now 400 spaces that they have reclaimed as public space for us to use. That sometimes wealthy people try to adopt the space next to them, but they are spaces that we own. They're the end of streets, Friends of Street Ends, and a lot of times they've been kind of made as nice little parkettes that you can go to. And they've got an app and they've got a list. So there's 400 of those you can check on.
How many of you walk alleys? That's one thing I love to do. I'm an alley walker. Yeah, I love wandering alleys. I've never seen a potato.
I have seen a lot of potatoes.
You have?
I don't have any theories. I've seen them far and wide. I've seen them in Rainier Beach. I've seen them in Lake City.
Is there like a club you all get to on?
Oh, a little potato spotter club.
Spud Spotter Club. What, tour? A book? Yeah, it'd be pretty ephemeral there. I don't know places to see before they decay.
Places potatoes have this.
111 potatoes in one breast.
Right, and one breast, yeah, you gotta include that.
How about the best blackberry patches? That's something on my walks at the right time of year.
I was told there was a really good one outside Dale Chihuli's studio underneath that freeway thing. But I that's just what I was told.
So the most delicious blackberries I've ever found are next to freeways.
In Ballard along the railroad tracks.
It's probably because of the heat, but it just seems wrong.
Well, I'm gonna just do a purely self-promotional thing along that line. So I write a weekly newsletter that's free, and it's all mine, just sort of rambles around the city and other places. And the next one will actually mention blackberries and freeways. Very exciting now. mind-bogglingly exciting. Not as exciting as potatoes. But if I see one, that's going to be a newsletter.
I think what a common theme from all of us is, it's like we have a goal that when people come to the city and want to know what's around, that we don't take them to the Sleepless in Seattle spots. I mean, there's so many more things to go see. And I think that's kind of what we're devoting our lives to, is like those other places.
There's someone seems to have a problem with their wrist over there. Can we help you with that? How much time do you want us to stop? Do you want us to do one more question? One more question. Observation, comment.
I have a question for you, just about your initial story of origin. You had that one day where you went out and everything was different. So what was behind that? Why was that day different?
The question was, why was the day that I set out different than any other day? I think it really was kind of my intention, and it wasn't, I have to go rush to get to the store. I have to go do this errand. I just didn't have anything else that I needed to be thinking about. And the way that I instantly kind of found that I was like tuning into myself and also tuning into the environment, I was like, whoa, I've never really had this experience before. And then going to all these different places and seeing all these things and knowing that I was the one who had made the decisions and that my body had been the one to take me to that place, it felt like magic. And it felt like I really realized that I thought to have fun, kind of, you needed to have money and a car and a bunch of time off from work. And I realized I didn't need any of those things. I just needed to set out without intention, really, besides my intention just being to walk. And it all just happened from there.
Thank you all. That's a perfect way to end it.
Copy of the books by these fantastic folks. Come right up here to the register for you. And they will be signing it. Thank you for coming. We're gonna stay and sign.
Yeah. Why
Rapidly diminishing.
So David, I enjoyed your.
Oh, good. Okay. And you are. Oh, yes. Oh, honey, yeah. Yes. That's been a while. Yeah. Good. Well, thank you. All right. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Well, your question was really.
Wrong way. Yeah, because you're blonde. Well, you guys are special. So
I like even numbers. That's okay. Whenever I like change the volume on it, I have to.
I'm just gonna. Oh, I got a piece of paper.
Take care.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Really? Great idea.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah, pretty cool. Yeah. So yeah. I don't have that one. the yellow one. I have the yellow.
Yeah, it didn't take me too much trouble to find her.
Yeah, no. It's,
Yeah, November, yeah.
oh yeah, well then glad you could make it. Yeah, we sat here and then like they went to start the YouTube feed list and I'm like, oh no, something I'm standing. The woman who started the YouTube feed.
Oh.
Like, so I was like, oh no.